It was 7 in the morning when I stepped out of my house, coffee in hand, expecting to feed the animals and enjoy the quiet hum of the pasture. Instead, I was greeted by the sound of a harp being tuned, a white gazebo planted right where my bulls usually rolled in the dirt, and a woman in a silk robe shouting, "Where are the hay bales with the golden ribbons?" I blinked twice, thinking maybe I was still dreaming, but no, standing in the middle of my privately owned pasture was Karen, hair in hot rollers, barefoot, and barking orders at a group of vendors as if she owned the place. Rows of chairs stretched across the grass, a giant catering van was parked dangerously close to my irrigation line, and one of the flower girls waved at me like I was the weird neighbor crashing the party. I hadn't even put on my boots yet. This wasn't just some event setup, it looked like the rehearsal day for a full-blown wedding, and it was happening on my land. Still in shock, I shuffled forward, trying to comprehend how someone had managed to build an entire wedding venue overnight on private farmland without permission. Karen noticed me at last and wrinkled her nose like I was interrupting her sacred ritual. "Oh good, you're here," she said, as if I were the help. "Can you move that rusty tractor thing? It's ruining the rustic vibe." I stared at her, speechless, watching her spin back around before I could utter a single word. Someone handed her a clipboard, and she nodded dramatically like she was orchestrating the Oscars. This was my property, my pasture, and my bull's favorite lounging spot, now temporarily converted into a Pinterest board come to life, all without my knowledge. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. I followed the extension cords and wires past the gazebo and found a generator humming loudly near my barn. Dale, Karen's cousin and the self-proclaimed event DJ, was unloading speakers and plugging in lights. I asked him who gave them permission to be here. He shrugged and said, "Karen said it was community land or something, she knows the HOA." I corrected him immediately. This was not community land. It was 100% privately owned, tax recorded under my name, and had been in my family for decades. "Well," he said, scratching his chin, "Karen said she talked to someone, and everything was fine. That someone clearly wasn't me." I stormed over to Karen, who was now mid-argument with a vendor over the color of the napkins. "Karen," I said as calmly as I could, "this is my land. You're trespassing. Take it all down." She gave me the kind of laugh only the entitled truly master, half scoff, half disbelief, with a dash of theatrical offense. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said. "It's one afternoon. You're not even using this field right now, and we already set everything up. The guests are flying in today. It's too late to change." I told her that wasn't my problem. She rolled her eyes and said, "You're being selfish. It's just one day. And it's going to be beautiful. You'll thank me later." It was then I noticed she had installed a makeshift sign at the edge of my property that read, "Welcome to the Wedding Hollow, a Karen event." It was painted in faux wood style with wedding rings as the logo. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a full-scale branding operation, and my pasture was being claimed like a conquistador planting a flag. I took photos. Every corner. Every cable. Every out-of-place decoration. I told her I was calling the sheriff. She said fine, go ahead, but she had a permit, and I'd be embarrassed when the truth comes out. When the sheriff arrived about 20 minutes later, I was standing near the gazebo with the property deed in hand. Karen greeted them with fake tears and claimed she was misled by a dishonest event coordinator and had no idea it wasn't approved land. She produced a crumpled document with my name spelled incorrectly at the bottom and a scribbled signature that looked like a drunk raccoon had written it. The deputy raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this doesn't even have a county seal. And this address is off by 3 digits. Karen played shocked, appalled, even betrayed. She begged for just a few hours and claimed everything was already paid for. I watched the deputy turn toward me, clearly exhausted from dealing with people like her. He asked if I wanted to press charges or just give her a formal warning. Part of me wanted her arrested on the spot, but I also knew the optics of shutting down a wedding would make me the villain in next-door gossip circles. I told them she had 24 hours. That was me being generous. She smiled sweetly and said, "Thank you. You won't regret this." But I already did. And the smirk she gave me as the deputies walked off? That wasn't a relieved bride. That was a woman who thought she'd just pulled off the heist of the century. I had a feeling she wasn't planning to leave, not after she'd sunk this much time and effort into staging her fairy tale. She didn't see my land. She saw a business opportunity. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to be over by morning. Later that evening, I took a walk along the pasture fence, watching the last rays of sun fall on the hay bales now dressed in white ribbons. My bulls were penned in the back lot, clearly annoyed by the intrusion and pacing with their usual huffs. I scratched behind Tank's ears and whispered, "Don't worry, buddy. Your moment's coming." I looked back at the gazebo, standing tall like it owned the land. Karen had poked the wrong bear, or in this case, the wrong rancher. The thing about living in the country is that people forget how much of it runs on respect. Respect for the land. Respect for boundaries. And most importantly, respect for bulls that don't take kindly to being moved. As I turned to head back inside, a car pulled up near the gate. It was another vendor. They got out, wheeled in crates of champagne, and asked me where to set up the pre-wedding brunch. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I realized Karen wasn't packing up. She was scaling up. She'd twisted my 24-hour mercy into a full green light. She was going to run the wedding anyway and dare me to stop her in front of 200 people. That's when I knew I wasn't just going to stop her. I was going to make sure she remembered this day for the rest of her life. And it wouldn't be with a lawsuit. Or a fine. Oh no. It would be with hooves. And horns. And a whole lot of mud. The morning after the sheriff's visit, I had a sliver of hope that Karen might have come to her senses. I figured she'd start packing up the ridiculous gazebo, tell her guests it was all a misunderstanding, and maybe send over a lukewarm apology note written in calligraphy. Instead, I woke up to the smell of lavender incense, the sound of a flute playing something suspiciously close to "My Heart Will Go On," and the sight of a dozen yoga mats spread across my pasture like confetti after a parade. Karen was at the front of the group in full warrior pose, shouting affirmations about manifesting abundance and opening heart chakras. Meanwhile, a photographer hovered nearby snapping glamour shots like she was the queen of serenity. I watched from my porch, stunned. She hadn't backed down. She'd doubled down. By the time I got my boots on and reached the gate, I saw the worst of it. She had installed a new sign. This one was professionally printed and mounted to a wooden post. It read "Pastoral Bliss Events, a tranquil rustic wedding destination." Underneath was a tagline, "Where love meets the land." She had even added a phone number and website link. I stared in disbelief, feeling my blood pressure spike as two people in matching polos carried a portable archway across my grass. Karen caught my eye and waved like we were old friends. "Morning," she chirped. "Isn't it magical?" I didn't respond. I just turned and walked to the barn. The bulls were pacing in their pen again, clearly disturbed by the new chaos. Even they looked like they were getting tired of Karen's nonsense. Inside the barn, I pulled out the dusty file cabinet that held our property records, county maps, and deed copies. I laid everything out on the table and began organizing it like I was prepping for a courtroom trial. Because that's what this was starting to feel like. A courtroom without a judge, just a landowner trying to wrest back control from a woman who thought property lines were optional if your decorations were cute enough. I took photos of the new signage, the yoga class, and the event setup. Then I called my friend Micah, a part-time lawyer and full-time cynic. He came over within the hour, and as soon as I showed him the fake lease Karen had waved around to the sheriff, he burst out laughing. "This isn't even amateur forgery," he said. "This is like she printed it in WordPad and signed it with her elbow." I asked what my options were. He said I could file a formal cease and desist, which would take a few days, or go to small claims and pursue damages. But he had a better idea: leverage. Document everything. Every car that drives in, every guest that trespasses, every ad she posts. The more evidence you have, the stronger your case if she pushes this any further. Also, you might want to have your bulls ready. I glanced up at that last part. He grinned. I'm not saying let them loose. I'm just saying, make sure she knows they're not props. Later that afternoon, I walked the fence line with a GoPro strapped to my chest and a notepad in hand. I recorded everything. The generator running by the barn. The catering van emptying supplies into my equipment shed. The porta-potties lined up right along the irrigation ditch. Someone had even strung fairy lights through the old elm tree, stapling cords into the bark like it was some kind of enchanted grove. The disrespect was astonishing. Then came the final straw. I found brochures, glossy, printed, and stuffed into my mailbox. Pastoral Bliss was being marketed across the county. Pictures of my land. My bulls, even. Tank was shown in the background of one shot grazing near the barn, and the caption read, "Meet our friendly mascots." I nearly dropped the brochure in disbelief. Karen had turned my life, my livelihood, into a backdrop for her fantasy business. I called the HOA president, Greg, hoping for some kind of support. Greg sounded nervous. I could hear golf balls clinking in the background. "Look," he said, "Karen is my cousin. She's intense. But I didn't give her any green light. And that permit she's waving around? It's not real. We have no jurisdiction over your land, and we're not touching this with a 10-foot pole." I told him she mentioned his name. He groaned. "She throws my name around to make herself sound official. Honestly, I've stopped answering her calls." I asked if he'd testify if things got legal. He hesitated. "If it comes to that, I'll back you. But keep it quiet, yeah? She's got friends in county planning. Last thing I need is her stirring up drama on my end." That was code for "you're on your own." With Greg out and the HOA distancing themselves, it became clear I had no choice but to push back myself. I wasn't going to let her walk over me just because she had a Pinterest board and a Bluetooth speaker. I returned to the barn and started prepping the bullpen. Tank, Pickle, and Sir Hornsalot were restless already. I cleaned out their feed troughs, gave them extra hay, and reinforced the gates just enough to control the situation. They weren't dangerous animals by nature, but they were territorial, and they'd been forced off their land. I began to formulate a plan, one that would let Karen finish her little wedding parade, but remind her, very publicly, who actually ran the land she was trespassing on. That night, I installed trail cams along the perimeter and set up motion alert. I added a large hand-painted sign just inside the property line that read, "Private agricultural land bulls on site, enter at your own risk." Then I emailed it to Karen and CC'd the sheriff's office for good measure. 10 minutes later, I got a reply from Karen. No greeting. No punctuation. Just 3 words. "You will regret." That was all I needed to know. She had no intention of backing down. In her mind, this wasn't theft. This was destiny. Her little business was about to become real, no matter what it cost. By morning, her guests began arriving again. A new group of women in matching robes posed for photos on hay bales, and a drone buzzed overhead capturing sweeping footage of my property. Karen pranced in front of the gazebo like a model in a bridal catalog. She even brought in a white horse for photo op. The photographer waved at me like we were colleagues. I stood by the gate, arms crossed, watching the whole thing unfold. She was pretending it was already hers, like my land was simply waiting for someone with better taste to reclaim it. But while she laughed and posed and dreamed of rustic Instagram fame, she forgot the most important thing. You can build all the gazebos you want. You can decorate a pasture. You can even spin a lie into a fairy tale. But this isn't the suburbs. This is ranch country. And around here, when you trample on someone's land, the land fights back. And sometimes it fights with horns. The sky was blue, the clouds hung just right, and the scent of lavender and trampled grass clung to the air like a bad perfume. The so-called wedding day had arrived, and my pasture had been transformed into a theme park of entitlement. There were rented white tents near the barn, garlands strung across fence posts like this was some kind of open-air ballroom, and folding chairs aligned in perfect rows leading up to the monstrosity of a gazebo that now stood like a crown jewel of trespass. The nerve of it all was staggering. Karen wasn't just using my land. She had claimed it, dressed it up, and repurposed it like she had inherited it through royalty. Her family and guests had no idea they were sitting on a bomb about to go off. I wasn't going to stop her ceremony with lawyers or sirens. I was going to let nature intervene, specifically the large, horned kind. The bulls had been fed early that morning. Tank, Pickle, and Sir Hornsalot were pacing inside their holding pen, agitated but controlled. They'd spent the past few days isolated from their normal stomping grounds, which only heightened their restlessness. Every loudspeaker check, every foreign perfume wafting through the air, every child shrieking from excitement on the property they knew as theirs added another ounce of tension. It wasn't rage. Bulls don't do rage. But they do irritation, and they do unpredictability. And today they were going to be very, very expressive. From a distance, I watched Karen make her grand entrance. She was riding on the back of a white carriage drawn by 2 draft horses, imported for the day, no doubt. The carriage wheels had already cut deep ruts into the grass, ruining the water flow from my irrigation setup. But Karen didn't care. She stepped out in a blinding dress that sparkled even under daylight, flanked by bridesmaids in color-coordinated western wear, each holding a mason jar bouquet like they were auditioning for a country music video. The harpist began plucking something soft and overly sentimental while Karen's mother, sitting in the front row, dabbed at her eyes like she was witnessing history. It was so fake it made my stomach twist. But I said nothing. I just waited. As the minister stepped up to the gazebo and began the rehearsed script, the air shifted. That was my cue. I walked to the side paddock and opened the gate, not fully, not recklessly. I just loosened the hinges and gave the bulls the option. I didn't wave a flag or prod them or force anything. I just opened the boundary and stepped back. At first, nothing happened. They sniffed the air. One pawed at the ground. Then, with the grace of animals who know exactly what belongs to them, they began to move. It started with Pickle. He was the smallest but the most curious. He trotted through the gap and looked around like someone exploring a familiar playground that had been redecorated. Then came Tank, lumbering forward with his usual heavy gait. Sir Hornsalot took his time. He was older, meaner, and proud. When he crossed the line, it was with full awareness that something was off. They didn't charge. Not yet. But their presence alone set off murmurs in the back rows. One child pointed. A guest asked, "Are those bulls supposed to be here?" Karen ignored it. She was too caught up in the moment. That moment didn't last. Pickle wandered into the aisle and bumped into a chair, causing it to topple over with a clatter. A woman screamed. Another stood to take a photo, thinking this was some kind of gimmick. Then Tank snorted, deep, guttural, and started walking directly toward the flower arch. That was when chaos bloomed. A bridesmaid shrieked and ran. A groomsman tried to intercept and got nudged to the ground for his trouble. Karen turned, saw the animals, and let out a sound I'll never forget, a mixture of outrage, fear, and denial. "No, no, no. This is not happening," she yelled, trying to hold her veil in place while backing into the gazebo. But the bulls weren't interested in her. They were interested in reclaiming their territory. Tank knocked over a speaker, which sparked and hissed. Pickle chased a running child briefly before getting distracted by the wedding cake table. Sir Hornsalot, true to his name, wandered up the aisle, dragging a white satin runner behind him like a trophy. Karen was yelling at everyone, including me, screaming, "Control your animals!" as if she had forgotten whose animals they were. I stood at the edge of the field, arms folded, watching like a man enjoying poetic justice in real time. The DJ, Karen's cousin Dale, tried to play calming music through his half-broken speaker system, but it only added a bizarre soundtrack to the stampede. The horse, still tied to the carriage, panicked and yanked hard, snapping the reins and bolting across the pasture with the carriage bouncing behind. It smashed into one of the porta-potties, sending it tipping sideways in a spray of blue water and horror. Guests began fleeing in every direction. A woman's high heel got stuck in the mud. Someone tripped over a champagne bucket. I swear I saw a man dive into the flower arrangements like he was escaping a war zone. Then came the climax. Karen, standing soaked and furious, attempted to grab a bull by the rope halter. Sir Horncelot snorted and spun, flinging a glob of mud directly onto her dress. She screamed, slipped, and landed hard in a puddle, her veil flying off and getting trampled moments later. Her mother gasped like someone had committed a crime. Karen sat there in the middle of it all, soaked in mud and humiliation, mascara running down her face, while Pickles sniffed at the wrecked cake stand behind her. The entire scene had been captured. Multiple guests had their phones out, filming as the elegant countryside wedding turned into a livestock uprising. Within hours, videos began circulating. One clip of Karen yelling, "Stop the cows. This is my day," while holding her muddy dress had already hit 500,000 views by dinner. Someone edited it to dramatic music and added a slow-motion replay of her falling. The comments were ruthless. "Should have paid rent, Karen. This Pasture said no. The bulls are the real heroes." By the time the last guests had fled and the bulls were herded back into their pen, the only things left standing were broken chairs, crushed flower petals, and a gazebo that looked like it had survived a tornado. Karen didn't say another word to me. She climbed into a car with her ruined gown and her dignity in tatters, leaving behind her decorations, her dreams, and the remnants of a fantasy that had been built on stolen land. I locked the gate behind them. For the first time in days, the pasture was quiet again. The bulls rested, the air cleared, and the scent of lavender was gone. My land was mine again, not a stage or a backdrop or a business idea for someone who never respected boundaries. But the story was far from over. Karen wasn't the kind of person to take public embarrassment lightly. Something told me she'd be back, angrier, louder, and more unhinged than ever. But if she thought this was a defeat, she had no idea what came next. Because the land had already spoken. And I wasn't finished yet. It only took 2 days before the fallout from the wedding fiasco started rolling in like a dust storm you could see but couldn't stop. The videos had gone viral in ways I hadn't imagined. Not just a few trending hashtags, but full news coverage. Local stations were replaying the chaos with commentary like it was a football game. One anchor even did a dramatic reading of Karen's famous meltdown line, "Stop the cows, this is my day," and then broke into laughter. I thought that after being publicly humiliated, Karen might retreat into silence, lick her wounds, and maybe do some deep soul-searching. But Karen wasn't built for reflection. She was built for retaliation. And when she returned, it wasn't with wedding planners or caterers. It was with a lawyer and a camera crew. I was standing in the barn feeding the bulls when the familiar screech of Karen's SUV tires interrupted the peaceful morning. This time, she wasn't wearing bridal couture. She wore all black like she was mourning the death of common sense, flanked by a scrawny man in an oversized suit who looked like he had printed his business cards at the public library. Karen marched up to my porch while the man behind her fiddled with a leather briefcase that wouldn't close properly. She didn't knock. She simply announced, loudly and dramatically, that I was being sued for willful endangerment, property damage, and emotional sabotage. I nearly dropped the feed bucket. Emotional sabotage? Was that even a real legal term? I told her to get off my property, and that any communication would now go through my lawyer. She smiled, that unnerving kind of smile where you know someone is completely unhinged but convinced they're winning. The man behind her finally got the briefcase open and handed me a packet of poorly formatted papers. The first page spelled my last name wrong, and the incident description included the words, "rogue cattle invasion." I didn't even make it to the third paragraph before laughing. She thought she was going to beat me in court with a half-baked lawsuit built on lies and glitter glue. But I had every moment of her trespassing documented. The video footage, the fake lease, the property deed, her forged signature, and even her email threatening me. She had no case. But that didn't mean she wouldn't try. I called Micah again and gave him the packet. He reviewed it in silence, occasionally shaking his head. "This is a joke," he said, flipping to the last page. "She's using a template from a wedding dispute website. This is the legal equivalent of coloring outside the lines and calling it art." But as funny as it all was, Micah warned me not to take it too lightly. "She wants publicity," he said. "She's not trying to win. She's trying to flip the narrative. If she can turn herself into the victim, maybe she salvages her brand. Maybe she gets sympathy clicks, or a pity podcast interview." That hadn't occurred to me. Karen didn't just want revenge, she wanted relevance. Sure enough, she uploaded a video 2 days later titled, "How My Dream Wedding Was Attacked by a Rancher and His Bulls." She sat on a pristine couch, tears cued perfectly, speaking in soft, trembling tones about how she was lied to, threatened, and traumatized by livestock. She called my pasture a neglected field, said I lured her onto the land under false pretenses, and claimed I trained the animals to ruin her life. The comments were a battlefield. Half the people saw through it instantly and roasted her mercilessly. The other half, those who didn't know the full story, started buying into her victimhood. I couldn't believe it. After everything she did, she was trying to play the hero of her own disaster. But while Karen was busy performing for the internet, her support back home was crumbling. I started receiving quiet messages from HOA members, former friends of hers, and even vendors who had worked the wedding. They wanted to distance themselves. One caterer sent me receipts showing Karen had bounced a deposit check and then threatened to leave a bad review unless they still delivered. A makeup artist claimed Karen stiffed them on a travel fee and then told others the artist canceled last minute. It was clear Karen's behavior wasn't limited to just my land. She had a pattern, and people were finally fed up. The HOA board, sensing the heat, called an emergency meeting. I wasn't even part of the HOA, but they asked me to attend. That alone told me how far things had fallen. I walked into the clubhouse to find Greg, the president, nervously sipping water while a small crowd of homeowners sat in foldable chairs. Greg opened the meeting with a brief apology, for not stepping in sooner, for not verifying Karen's claims, and for, in his words, underestimating how far a Pinterest bride could push things. They voted that night to issue Karen an indefinite ban from HOA-sponsored events and revoked her community privileges, including clubhouse use. She wasn't expelled from the neighborhood yet, but they were one scandal away from it. The real kicker? Greg stepped down the next day. He said he was tired of being related to the reason our property values are dropping. Karen's house grew quiet. The SUV was gone for days. Her mailbox overflowed with uncollected letters. It was like she had vanished. But I knew it wasn't over. Someone like Karen doesn't disappear. She regroups. And she did, in spectacularly foolish fashion. The following week, I found out she was planning another event, this time in a neighboring community. She was calling it a healing celebration to reclaim her narrative, complete with spiritual advisors, local influencers, and a drone light show. I laughed when I saw the flyer. She hadn't learned anything. If anything, she'd leaned in deeper. But I didn't care. I had what I needed. With all the documentation collected and witness statements from multiple vendors and neighbors, I filed a counterclaim, not for show but to recover damages. The destruction in my pasture wasn't just cosmetic. The ruts from her carriage, the broken fence posts, the scorched patch of grass where her DJ's equipment had shorted out, all of it added up. I wasn't looking to bankrupt her. I just wanted to make it clear that real land, real work, and real property came with real consequences. My case was rock solid. Karen didn't even show up to the first court date. Her lawyer, if he could be called that, tried to delay, then withdrew after Karen stopped returning his calls. A few weeks later, the judgment came down in my favor. She was ordered to pay damages, remove all online materials using my land, and issue a public retraction. She never did the last part. But I got what I wanted, justice on paper. Even after all of that, the thing that stuck with people most wasn't the court battle or the fake lease. It was the bulls. They became legends in the neighborhood. Someone printed t-shirts with Tank's face on it that read, "Moving on up." Kids started asking their parents if they could visit the wedding cows. A local bakery made horn-shaped cookies. It was ridiculous, and kind of perfect. Karen had tried to make my land her fairy tale, and instead, it became my legend. Life slowly returned to normal. The grass regrew, the fences were repaired, and the bulls reclaimed their rightful place in the pasture. But every so often, a car would drive by just a little slower than usual, passengers peering out to see if the rumors were true. Sometimes I waved. Sometimes I just let them look. Because whether they were there for the story or the spectacle, it didn't matter. The message was the same. This land has a memory. And so do I. The weeks rolled by, and slowly but surely, the madness surrounding Karen's wedding catastrophe started to settle. The pasture healed. The ruts from the carriage tracks faded under new grass. The scorched area near the speaker stand began to regrow after I tilled and reseeded it. Even the bulls, after weeks of being local celebrities, had returned to their usual routine of stomping around, napping in mud, and asserting dominance by flicking dirt onto each other. What stuck with me, though, was how everything Karen had done, every lie, every fake permit, every social media stunt, had collapsed under its own weight, while the land and its rhythm simply carried on. But while I was ready to move forward, I hadn't realized the story wasn't entirely finished. Karen wasn't the kind of person to walk away from attention, and her final move was as petty as it was desperate. It started with whispers in town. Apparently, Karen had pitched an idea for a reality show. Not just a YouTube vlog or another pity-laced podcast, but a full-blown pitch for a series called Reclaim Dreams, in which she'd travel across the country helping brides take back their moment from so-called saboteurs. She filmed a pilot episode at a local vineyard, rented actors to reenact her version of the Pasture disaster, and even staged a redemption ceremony where she faced her trauma. It was bizarre. Worse, she tried to include footage from the original wedding, including clips taken without my permission. When word got back to me that a local influencer had shared teaser clips showing my property, I sent out takedown notices with Micah's help. The clips were removed within a day. But that didn't stop Karen from planning one last attention grab. One Saturday afternoon, I got a call from my cousin Benny, who ran a private security service and often helped at local fairs. He told me Karen was spotted walking around the property line with a tablet in hand, recording. She wasn't alone either. She had a man with a camera and another person holding a whiteboard with scene numbers written on it. She was trying to film again, clearly without permission. I drove down the dirt path in my truck, cutting across the pasture's north edge where the bulls usually graze. Sure enough, there they were. Karen in a beige jumpsuit with her signature fake smile, narrating something about rural forgiveness and rebirth, while standing dangerously close to my east gate. I didn't say a word at first. I waited, watching from inside the cab. The camera guy noticed me first and nudged Karen. She turned and tried to play it cool, waving like this was all a big misunderstanding. "Oh hey. I was just showing some friends the area," she called out, gesturing vaguely like she wasn't surrounded by film gear. I stepped out, arms crossed. "You're trespassing again," I said, voice flat. "And this time, you're doing it on camera." She tried to argue that the gate was open, conveniently pushed just enough to appear unlatched, and that she had every right to document her journey. I asked the camera crew if they had permits. They said they were freelancers and just following instructions. I told them I had no issue with them personally, but if their footage showed 1 inch of my land, they'd be hearing from a judge. They packed up quickly after that, whispering among themselves while Karen fumed and muttered something about creative suppression. After that final attempt, she seemed to vanish from the community spotlight. No more events, no more videos, no more appearances at HOA meetings she wasn't allowed into anymore anyway. Her house went up for sale within the month, listed discreetly by a real estate agent who looked like he regretted taking the job. When the moving truck finally pulled away, no one came to wave her off. No one brought cookies or cards. The street felt lighter somehow. Like a cloud had passed and the sun remembered it could shine again. With Karen gone and peace restored, I found myself standing in the middle of the pasture one evening, looking out over the now quiet space where the chaos had unfolded. It had once been my least favorite spot, the place where a woman's arrogance had nearly cost me my land's reputation. But now it felt like something else. It felt like a story that needed an ending. And maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. I started entertaining the idea of turning the incident into something good. The attention from the viral video had brought inquiries, real ones, from people who were interested in rustic weddings done the right way. Couples who wanted to get married surrounded by nature, who respected the land and its rhythms, who liked the idea of the bulls watching their vows from a safe distance behind the fence. One couple even joked they'd pay extra if Sir Hornsalot made an appearance. It seemed ridiculous at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. So I did what Karen never thought to do. I got permits. I met with the county board. I worked with a small event planner who understood how to balance charm with legality. We set boundaries, literally. A section of the pasture was fenced off properly. Portable structures were used instead of permanent ones. The bulls were relocated to a safe area for any booked events, and everything was done with safety in mind. I didn't advertise it loudly. No flashy websites or influencer posts. Just word of mouth and a sign at the farmer's market. But it took off faster than I expected. Bulls and vows was what people started calling it. One couple even brought commemorative hat. The first wedding was small, intimate, simple decor, a local band playing bluegrass under the trees, and a couple so respectful they asked to help clean up afterward. It reminded me why I'd loved the land in the first place. It wasn't just about property rights or ego. It was about creating space for something meaningful. And now that space belonged to people who saw it for what it was, not what they wanted to take from it. Somewhere down the line, someone started a rumor that I'd trained the bulls to respond to music. That they only appeared when someone played a harp. It was nonsense, of course. But I didn't bother correcting it. Let them believe the pasture had a bit of magic to it. If nothing else, it made for a good story. And it gave Tank, Pickle, and Sir Hornsalot a legacy far beyond their mud-loving hearts ever expected. One day, while checking the fence, I found a scrap of fabric tangled in the wire. It was white, satin-like, and torn at the edge, probably from Karen's wedding dress, left behind during the chaos. I held it for a moment, then tied it to the gatepost. Not out of sentiment but as a marker, a silent reminder of what had happened. A symbol that said, "This is where the nonsense ended and the real story began." And from that day forward, every time someone asked me how I started hosting weddings, I told them the truth, with a straight face and just enough of a smile. I told them a woman once built a gazebo in my pasture without asking. I told them she brought horses, decorations, and a harpist. And I told them she left covered in mud while 3 bulls reclaimed their land. They always laughed. And then they always said the same thing. We want our wedding to be nothing like hers. That, more than anything, felt like justice. Not revenge. Not a court victory. But a pasture full of peace, a business rooted in respect, and a story that people would pass around campfires and community meetings for years. Karen thought she was the main character. But in the end, it was the bulls that stole the show. And they didn't need a script, a camera, or a wedding arch. They just needed the gate open.